Alright guys, at the recommendation of YouTube user Easy Hacks, who recently posted a video on using retro controllers for retro gaming applications, whatever that application might be, he had mentioned, and I agree with him, at least based upon the ones that I've tried, that the reproduction NES controllers you can get, while they are convenient in that they provide USB connectivity, typically, the button feel generally isn't quite the same. Now this, as you can see, is an original vintage gamepad and obviously has the vintage button feel. So what we would like to do is to provide this with USB connectivity instead of this thing. Now, if there is something on the market that would let you plug this into a PC or some other type of a system, and they may very well exist. I've honestly not searched for them because I've already done this USB conversion years ago. You might just go that route. If they do exist, I don't know how much they cost or how well they work, but you might try that first before you go and hack apart your vintage NES gamepad. But that being said, the method that I use to convert an NES gamepad to USB is as follows. And if you want to see the Easy Hacks video that inspired me to do this, then I'm going to put a link to that video in the description below. Okay, so I got myself a relatively inexpensive USB keyboard, USB connectivity. You plug it into pretty much any computer system. It's going to be recognized as a standard USB keyboard. We are going to use the circuit board out of this keyboard. It's behind this panel here, and I got this from Micro Center here in Cincinnati. It's a chain of electronic stores. They have locations all over the country. Might be lucky enough to have one in your area. If not, don't fret. You can find these on Amazon or what have you. They're all over the place. Maybe even Goodwill. Maybe even your mom's basement, or maybe even your mom's computer. I don't know. But this is a Micro Center model 208397. Cost about $10 if I recall correctly. If you can't find one of those keyboards, or you would have to go out and find one, go out and buy one, something like that, what you might try first, excuse me, especially if you already own a reproduction USB NES gamepad, is to see if you can't just take that gamepad apart, take out the circuit board, open up your vintage NES gamepad, and put the repro circuit board inside of this, and see how well it matches up. You might be able to just use that circuit board. Maybe it'll require a little bit of modification to the insides of the NES gamepad case. Maybe require a little bit of modification or doctoring to the circuit board, but you might be able to get that to work. And if that's the case, especially if it's just a drop-in conversion, well then it's a no-brainer. Forget about the keyboard and the soldering and stuff that's going to be required with that, and just try going that route. So if you're in that situation, you already own the repro controller and you have a vintage controller, give that a shot and see if that works. That's what I would try first, to be completely honest with you, without going through some of the steps that you're going to have to go through to use that USB circuit board. But like I said, none of that stuff was really available years ago when I first did this conversion, so that's the route I went at that time. It was really about the best thing available to me. So when you open up that USB keyboard, and at the time I did the original conversion, I bought 2 of those keyboards. I was going to do multiple conversions. I've not used that second one for anything yet, as you can see. But the first one, I yanked that circuit board out, and this is the brains of the operation. That big keyboard enclosure has this little tiny circuit board attached to it on the inside. And you can see that it fits well within the constraints of the NES gamepad. And it's really not a very big deal at all to get it to fit on the inside. Now, in short, the way that we're going to go about connecting things is when you open up that keyboard, behind the keys there are these thin plastic membranes, and when you press one of the keys on the keyboard, those thin plastic membranes squeeze together, and these little conductive contacts on the membranes connect various pads on what they call CON2, connector 2. It's a thin ribbon cable, flat ribbon cable on the inside of the keyboard. Connects one of these pads on CON2 to one of these pads on CON1, or connector 1. These thin little tiny pads where the ribbon cable is originally attached are connected to these traces, and if you follow these traces around, ultimately you're going to see that each of these little contacts is also connected or has available one of these larger test pads to which we're going to be soldering. Now you can see blobs of solder on this one because, like I said, I've done this hack before, and I have soldered onto this board before, and I've used most of these solder pads at some point in the past. But I tore the whole thing apart because of, well, two main reasons. One, most importantly, I wanted to show you guys how I did what I did so that maybe you could do it yourself if you were so inclined. And also because I wanted to remap the buttons. I wanted to change which gamepad button presses emulated which keyboard button presses. And that's important. Originally, I soldered the NES Gamepad circuit board button contacts onto these different pads so as to minimize the number of wires and the number of connections I was going to have to make. In doing so, I wound up having the NES Gamepad button presses mapped to some semi-inconvenient things, or just almost random types of things, really. Like up was 2, left was backslash, right was, backspace, things along those lines. I want to remap this so that up is up, down is down, left is left, right is right. Select is probably going to be like tab, start will probably be like enter, B is B, and then A will be A, all right? Which seems to make a little more sense. Because of how I use these controllers, I will occasionally unplug the gamepad and plug in that small USB keyboard or something like it. And it's nice to be able to quickly and easily remember which keyboard presses would emulate the desired gamepad press. So if I unplug the gamepad and plug in the keyboard, I know that still up is up, down is down, left is right, B is B, A is A, so on and so forth. But when up is 2 and left is backslash and down is R or whatever the case might be, it's a little bit tougher to remember, as well as being more difficult to play on the keyboard for those purposes. So anyway, the next part of this video is going to focus on how you go about mapping out these different contacts and determining which contacts need to be connected to which contacts in the NES Gamepad circuit board, such that when you press each of the buttons, you get the desired keyboard output. All right, guys, I'll be back in a few. Thanks. In this part of the video, as I had indicated, I'm going to demonstrate to you how it is that we map out which contact combinations on this circuit board produce which keyboard presses. It's pretty straightforward, to be completely honest with you. It's just it's a little bit tedious. There are literally 8 pads on connector 1. And there are 18 pads on connector 2, so you've got over 150 or nearly 150 anyway possible combinations you're going to have to go through. There's a bunch of them, so you're going to have to emulate this process several times over, and that's an understatement, in order to map this whole thing out. But it's doable, and it is worth it, and it's pretty much necessary if we want to be successful at this project. So with that, I have the circuit board taped down just to make it a little more stable and a little easier to do this. You want to be careful during this process, and this is not plugged into the computer just yet, but it will be in a moment. You're going to want to get yourself some piece of wire. You might have some electrical connectors. You might have different piece of wire, something you can use to fairly precisely touch one of the connector 1 pads at the same time as you connect one of the connector 2 pads. Connector 1 pads I have numbered 1 through 8, and there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And the connector 2 pads I have numbered 1 through 18. They go through all of these, and then down here I've got number 18. So you want to check out all possible combinations, and you want to write down the results that you get. Now, there's a tool that I use to figure out what button press is being emulated when I connect any 2 of those contacts. If you just go on Google and you search for keyboard tester, you're going to find something like this. You can see it's www.keyboardtester.com/tester, but if you just Google keyboard tester, there are a lot of different websites that have these available. And what it is, in short, is a real simple web application that will tell you what keyboard key is being pressed at any given moment in time. For example, I'm going to hit my space bar on my regular keyboard, and it clicks and it highlights the space bar when you hit it. Pretty simple, right? And it also show you up in this little text box what it is that you're doing, if in fact it is a character or a space type key that you're pressing. So what we're going to do each time we connect any one of these two contact combinations on the circuit board, it's going to show us what key that emulates. And we want to record that. And what I have here, and when I say record, we want to write it down. I have a spreadsheet that, and I've already obviously mapped this out. I have a spreadsheet showing the connector 1 contacts across the top here. I have them numbered 1 through 8, and actually 8 is off the screen right now. And then connector 2 contacts 1 through 18. And then where each of those two intersect, for example, I found that connector 1 contact 3 and connector 2 contact 7 produce a shift key press. Now, I don't know if this is left shift or right shift. This keyboard tester web app does not tell you whether it's the left or right. It just tells you that it's one of the shift keys that's being pressed. You could use, there's some gaming software like GTA comes to mind, you could probably use to figure out whether or not it's the left shift or the right shift. I believe it differentiates between the two, or any one of a number of different programs like that, if that's important to you. For me, just the fact that it's a shift key is fine with me. And I'm probably going to map my shift key to the select key. I've also determined, and I've highlighted in red, the buttons that I'm going to use for my NES Gamepad Conversion. I know where the Enter key is, the A key, up, down, right, left, and the letter B. You could select any of these that you want. And you also notice that there are some blanks. There were some contact combinations I discovered didn't seem to do anything. Some contact combinations put the computer to sleep or shut it down, or things along those lines. So you want to make sure that you emulate all that stuff, and don't be surprised if when you're going through this same testing procedure, if some of these contact combinations you try make your computer go to sleep, or launch the calculator, or other functions like that that are frequently built into some of these USB keyboards. Also, be careful when you're doing this, and again, this is at your own risk. It shouldn't harm your PC. If it harms anything, it might just harm this board itself. Try to only get the wire on one connector 1 contact pad and one connector 2 contact pad at any given time. Don't cross multiple pads, and don't try to connect other connectors. Fortunately, the way this one is laid out, it's kind of difficult to hit more than one thing at once. Or if you were to hit one connector 1 contact pad at the same time, you maybe accidentally hit 2 of the connector 2 contact pads, probably not going to be a big deal. In fact, the keyboard circuit board is probably just going to look at that as multiple keys being pressed at the same time on the keyboard, so it really shouldn't hurt anything. So never fear. And again, you're dealing with low voltages, extremely low currents. The risk of any kind of fire or shock or anything like that is going to be pretty minimal, if not pretty much non-existent. But all that being said, do this at your own risk. If you're not comfortable with it, then don't do it and find another route. But with that, and if you decide you want to move forward with it and give it a shot, then by all means continue. I am now going to plug the USB cord into my PC. Alright, detected it. Little light came up that might be, maybe that's the numlock key or something like that. Or indicates that numlock is on right now. I believe that's what that might be. And computer instantly recognized it as a USB keyboard, as it should. Now what I'm going to do is, just to show you guys, and this is going to be a pretty short section, or well, not much longer anyway. Let's look at, say, A, for example. That's connector 1, 3, and connector 2, 18. That should show up as the letter A. Alright. So we're going to go connector 1, 3, which is right here, and connector 2, 18, which is down here. So if I touch that there, and actually I need to activate the keyboard tester window so it picks it up. So I go 3 and 18. And you can see here on the keyboard tester screen. Sorry, I'm using a cell phone camera attached to a little tripod to do this stuff, and it's not the easiest thing in the world to manipulate. But if I hit connector 1, 3 and connector 2, 18, you can see it's detecting a letter A keyboard press, okay? Which is exactly what I've recorded over here in my spreadsheet. So what you're going to have to do is go through all of the contacts on that keyboard circuit board, or whatever it is that you might use, and map all of that stuff out, at least until you've identified which keyboard contact pad combinations produce which keyboard button presses that you're interested in mapping the NES Gamepad buttons to. This can be a somewhat tedious process, but you know, be patient, take your time, it's worth it. All right, thanks guys, see you back in just a minute. This is the vintage gamepad that I had previously used with this modification that I've since I disassembled. I desoldered everything from the USB keyboard circuit board and desoldered everything I'd previously soldered to the NES Gamepad circuit board. I wanted to open this up and show you, well, generally what it's going to look like when you first open your vintage gamepad and begin the modifications to it. I've gone ahead and removed the 6 screws from the back. After you do that, you will pop it open. Now what you will see on yours when you first open it is probably an integrated circuit that's going to be located right here. That's the integrated circuit that the NES console communicates with to figure out what buttons you're pressing while you're playing games with the original console. We're not going to need that integrated circuit, by the way. So you'll pop that board out and you'll flip it over. And actually you're also going to have the original USB controller wires, that the individual wires that are in the cable are going to go through these individual holes here. What you're going to want to do first is to desolder that integrated circuit, take that chip out of there, you don't need it for this modification, and to desolder those wires from the controller cable and pull those out. You're not going to need those for this modification either, which leaves you with this. Now in the next section, what I'm going to show you is basically an image of this circuit board along with some drawn in photoshopped notations and my narration describing the modifications you're going to have to make to this board. They're relatively minor, but there are a few modifications you'll have to make to this board in order to adapt it to your USB keyboard circuit board. You're going to have to cut a couple traces, you might have to put a couple holes in somewhere to prepare spots to which you will solder the wires that connect to the USB keyboard circuit board. Again, they're relatively minor, but some work is going to have to be done. Also on that image, I'll indicate what each of these pads connect to. This is just up, down, left, right, select, start, B, and A. The modifications you have to do specifically are going to depend upon your specific USB device. You might have to make some general modifications, but it's actually pretty simple. You just have to kind of get the concept down. This is a rubber pad. This actually sits behind the directional pad on the gamepad. So when you push up, for example, on the gamepad, it presses down on one of these little sort of springy rubber pads. Okay, it'll push down and it pushes that little black, let's see if I can get the camera to focus here. It'll push this little black conductive pad outward, in that manner. And when it does, if you're hitting up, for example, that black conductive pad will hit these two contact areas on the circuit board and complete the circuit. This little black pad inside of here is conductive, and these are conductive. So all you're doing is completing the circuit. It just acts like a little momentary rubbery switch is exactly what you're doing. So to one side of this contact, you'll have one wire soldered that goes to the USB keyboard chip, and the other end you'll have soldered to another contact on the USB keyboard chip. So one of them will be connected to a connector 1 connection on the USB chip, and the other side will be connected to the USB or the connector 2 contact on the USB keyboard chip. And we are going to take advantage of these traces that exist on this circuit board and reuse as many of these holes or as many of these locations or existing pads as we can, so that we minimize the modifications that have to be made to this circuit board. You know, the wires are already on here in the form of these traces, so why not take advantage of them to the extent that we can. But again, that'll be in the next stage of the video. Now, I will add that while you've got this thing disassembled, it's probably a good idea for you to do a little bit of preventive maintenance. Over the years, obviously using these controllers and these gamepads, and this goes for, you know, vintage gamepads you're keeping in vintage form and vintage connectivity. It goes for retro gamepads or any of that stuff. It's not a bad idea on occasion to open them up, take out the circuit board. You don't have to necessarily desolder anything if you're just doing maintenance, but take out the circuit board, take out all of these pads, take out all the buttons. They're just plastic buttons. They just fall out of here, and the start and select buttons are built into the pad itself. And clean all this stuff. You know, you could just use, you could use some like 70% rubbing alcohol if you wanted. You could just use water, a damp paper towel, baby wipes, whatever. And also clean off the back sides of these rubber contact pads. Clean those off. Don't scrub them. Don't try to get all the black off. It's the black stuff that conducts the electricity. So just sort of clean them up and get the dust and the crud off. And do the same thing with each of these black contact spots where all the different button presses contact the circuit board. Again, you don't want to rub off all the black stuff. Just sort of get the dust and the grime and the crud off. You might find that if you have a gamepad that's not as responsive or doesn't seem to work as well, or you seem to have to press extra hard on a given button or direction in order to get it to work, it might just be because this stuff is dirty. So clean that stuff off, put it back together, and see if that solves that issue, if that's the kind of problem that you're having. But since we're going to have this disassembled for this project, it's a good idea to go ahead and do that maintenance right now. And that way you can at least eliminate the possibility of having dirty contact related issues over the course of this project. All right, guys, back in just a moment. Okay, here's the image that I've modified, image of the NES Gamepad circuit board with some Photoshop modifications that I have made to demonstrate where I'm going to have things soldered and some of the changes that I'm going to make to my gamepad circuit board in order to get things to work correctly. Now, you will see a series of colored dots or colored lines or, you know, blue circles, for example, and those all indicate different things that need to be done to this circuit board in order to connect it to the USB keyboard circuit board. You see a little bit of language and some indicators and colors and dots and what have you below the image of the circuit board, and those indicate which USB keyboard contacts get soldered to each location of the NES Gamepad circuit board. You will also see a series of red lines, just sort of those hash marks going across PCB traces on the NES Gamepad circuit board. Those indicate, those are locations where you'll want to cut through the actual trace on the circuit board. You can do that with a X-Acto knife, razor blade, a pocket knife might do it. That copper foil that comprises the circuit board traces is not terribly tough stuff. You just want to make sure that you get a nice clean cut. You don't have any little fragments of metal or what have you that might still bridge over the little gap that you're cutting. Make sure you get a nice clean cut. I will also say that to the extent that you can,
do your best to avoid drilling holes through the circuit board, through the gamepad circuit board, because if you want to pass the wire through a hole through the back side, that means on the other side of the circuit board, on the other side of the image you're looking at right now, you're going to have a wire that pops up and protrudes through. So that could present an obstacle to laying the keyboard circuit board flat up against the back of this one. So go ahead and study this for a little bit. Hopefully it's straightforward enough, showing what I'm trying to do. I will also say that the blue circles that I have around some of the contacts simply indicates that those contacts that are encompassed by those circles will all be tied together, and you can do that through a number of different means. I will probably just use short pieces of jumper wire or something along those lines in order to accomplish that. You might also be able to accomplish it by taking advantage of some of the PCB traces that are on there, just making shorter bridge pieces between some of those. Alright guys, so I'm going to go ahead and make these modifications to my circuit board, and I'll be back here momentarily to show you the modifications I've completed. I'm also going to go ahead and solder on the connecting wires to the NES Gamepad circuit board that will ultimately connect to the USB keyboard circuit board. Alright, thanks guys, back in a moment.
Okay, for those of you who have actually stuck it out for the remainder of this video, the last installment of this video, here we go. This is it. Alright, like I said in the last installment, I was going to go ahead and solder up make the modifications to the gamepad PCB and solder connections where indicated on the graphic to the USB keyboard PCB. And I've gone ahead and done that. I used actually a length of wire, of cable actually, from an old IDE hard drive cable. Really fine wires, solid copper wires, so they were a little stiff, but just stiff enough, and they're so thin they bend really easily. What I liked about it is it makes a nice clean bend around the top edge of the board here, and made it relatively easy to route everything. I used a little bit of hot glue to adhere the keyboard PCB to the back of the gamepad PCB. I didn't have to drill any holes in the gamepad PCB or the keyboard PCB. I did have to make a couple of minor modifications to the inside of the gamepad body, and actually just to the back panel. These two cylindrical sections here, which actually provide support against the back side of the circuit board, so that when you're mashing on the keys, it doesn't cause the board to bend or pull away or push away or possibly even crack. I had to relieve a little bit of those. You can see this one's actually, I kind of took a little bit of a notch out of it. Had to relieve a little bit of them just to allow for the additional thickness posed by the keyboard circuit board, but these solidly contact the back side of the gamepad circuit board and the keyboard PCB, so we still don't get any flex or any play in there, which is what you want. You want it to be nice and solid. You don't want it to move around or flex or bend or, God forbid, crack. So I'm going to go ahead and throw this thing back together. We're going to plug it in. I'm going to show you that it works. I'll also say that I did go ahead, obviously, like I'd indicated, and cleaned all of the PCB board contacts and the conductive sections of these rubber pads, just to make sure everything plays correctly and gets good contact and doesn't give us any kind of issues along those lines. You also notice that I'm going to use the original routing used by the original NES Gamepad cable. Take advantage of those posts that are in place there, and you want to make sure you do that. You see how I'm wrapping that around these posts here. They're ridged because that's where the cable was supposed to pass. We're going to go ahead and take advantage of that, because what they allow you to do is relieve stress. So inevitably you're going to pull on this cable, and if it's wrapped around these posts, the cable and that tension won't pull on these connections and possibly harm those. So we want to go ahead and use those since they are available. Okay, you can see everything snaps back together nice and evenly. I'm going to go ahead and put in the screws. You might notice I'm using a, for those of you who have seen them, if you ever do shop at Micro Center, if I get this camera, there we go, the teeny turner. Those come from Micro Center. It's kind of in the impulse buy section up by the registers. They got all these goofy little cheap gadgets and what have you. And somebody actually got me this for Christmas or something like that a few years ago, several years ago actually. And I just kind of laughed when I saw it. I'm like, I see those things in the check lane at Micro Center all the time. And I never really thought about getting one just because I thought they were just these silly little things. But it's super handy. It's really handy because you can put a lot of torque, relatively speaking, on a fastener. And it comes with all these different bits. And they're the really fine bits. The really small ones that fit a lot of these really fine screws. So, you know, you get some bits that are as small as like the little jeweler screwdrivers like this, or you know, even smaller, or as small as the smallest jeweler screwdrivers, but you can put a lot more torque on it. You get a much better grip on it, and it's actually a pretty high quality little tool considering how relatively inexpensive it is, and what it looks like. And it's got that funny little teeny turner name. Yeah. No, it's actually pretty neat, and I use it all the time. It's always in whatever toolbox I'm using at any given point in time, or it's always on the workbench. Pretty funny little gadget. The screws that go with this thing are really long, which is good. Nintendo made some pretty good peripherals, controllers and what have you. Constructed them pretty well. Minimalist, but functional. We'll put it that way. Okay, so there we have it. Man, it feels just like a vintage gamepad, which is exactly what it should feel like. So I'm just going to go ahead and plug it into my PC. Turn the speakers on here. Ba-boom. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and pull up the keyboard tester app, web app. Sorry. Okay, and if I get it kind of focused on the section here. Okay, up, down, left, right, B, A, select, which is shift, and start, which is enter. Up, up, down, down, left, right, B, A. Select start for a two-player game of Contra. Alright, there you go, guys. Well, you know, if you have any luck, if you decide to do this build yourself, you have any luck, you have any questions, you just want to say, wow, this video was way too long and I wasted my time because I could have just saved a bunch of time and trouble and money by spending 10 bucks on a USB adapter ready to go, then, you know, any of those things, just let me know. Thanks a lot, guys, and thanks to Easy Hacks for prompting me to make this video. Alright, see you guys. Good luck.